Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news. You're listening to Bloomberg Businessweek with Carol Massar and Tim Stenovec on Bloomberg Radio.
Well, as we've been talking about all day, plans to sign a critical minerals deal between the U.S. and Ukraine were scrapped after Donald Trump's meeting Friday with Volodymyr Zelensky quickly devolved into a fiery exchange over the Ukrainian leader's doubts that the U.S. president's efforts to broker a deal with Russia would yield lasting peace. We know this. Zelensky departed the White House following that spat and a planned signing ceremony. That press conference was canceled. It's unclear what happens next at this point. Really curious what Greta Uehling thinks about all of this and also of the big picture, because she's a cultural anthropologist and a Ukraine expert. She's professor of international and comparative studies at the University of Michigan. She's the author of the new book, Decolonizing Ukraine, the Indigenous People of Crimea and Pathways to Freedom. She joins us this afternoon from Ann Arbor, Michigan. Professor, good to have you with us. A very timely book, and we're pleased to have you on a day where we're talking so much about what's happening in Ukraine. Why is it important to understand the indigenous history of this particular group in Ukraine in the context of the Ukraine war that's being fought right now?
Yes. Well, thanks for having me. Decolonizing Ukraine basically refers to Ukraine's process of ridding itself of the effects of Russian domination politically, economically, culturally, and psychologically. Current events amplify the book's central findings because the United States is taking a colonial attitude toward the countries that it seeks to dominate. Now, Ukraine is in a position to rid itself of Russian military aggression and this enabling environment that has been created by the American administration. In the book, a major focus of this is sort of the cognitive dimensions of this. And I think that as a whole, the book looks at how Ukraine sort of transformed itself since the revolution. And that's where the indigenous people come in, because it was after the 2014 occupation of Crimea that many of them fled.
Okay.
And that provided, paradoxically, a very important opportunity for the indigenous Crimean Tatars and the Ukrainians to begin to understand how much they had in common and to begin to strategize together about their country.
Professor, forgive me, I want to jump in because we only have a few minutes with you. And as Carol and I were preparing for this, we talked about our interview that we had yesterday with Alexander Vindman, who spent many years studying the region. He was actually born in Ukraine. And I asked him yesterday in this conversation that we had with him what Russia ultimately wants. And he said, Russia wants all of Ukraine. And he talked about the history of Russia seeing Ukraine as part of Russia. How does that statement gel with what you found out about who are the indigenous people of Crimea, who are the indigenous people of Ukraine, and what is their connection to Russia?
Right. Well, that's a great question, because the indigenous people have a lot of experience with this, having been colonized first by Russia in 1783. And basically, I would concur with him and state that we saw that very clearly when Russia occupied the Crimean Peninsula. So when they occupied the Crimean Peninsula, they seek to basically rid it of the indigenous people, who were formerly 95% of the population, and replace the population with Russians, right? So hundreds of thousands of Russians have immigrated into Crimea. And in this process, right, they have basically replaced the indigenous population with their own. And then that becomes a platform for trying to justify these territorial incursions.
Well, and I think about, it's been an interesting day. It's been an interesting week. It's been an interesting 3 years and a rough 3 years in terms of watching the war between Russia and Ukraine. Forgive me. I do think about our audience who are listening to you, and this is, a slice of the population, correct, in Ukraine. Why do you think it's important that they really understand this and the plight of the indigenous people of Ukraine?
I think that there's a strong parallel to be made with the United States struggle to provide justice and dignity to the Black population in America. So that's one parallel. I think it also has to do with, um, the book is basically a study in resilience, and Americans are going to need a lot of resilience in coming years because with, Russia not stopping at Ukrainian borders, there are like basically food security issues, nuclear security issues, environmental issues. Of course, energy is a factor, as well as the potential for more mass migration and territorial incursions. And so basically, it's about the kind of world that we want to live in. Do we want to live in a world where there is the rule of law and everybody has dignity and opportunities? Or do we want to live in a world where that's not the case?
It seems like it's not a question of what we want necessarily or the type of world we want to live in. It's a question of how this war ends at this point, given what happened today. Trump and Zelensky failing to reach a deal after that clash at the White House. We don't know what happens next, as I mentioned, but certainly I think a lot of people are describing this as off the rails right now. How do you think this war ends?
I would agree that it's off the rails, and I would agree that what happened in the Oval Office today was deeply unfortunate. And I don't know how this war ends, but the one thing I know is that Ukraine will not allow itself to be humiliated. Ukraine will keep fighting. We may recall that in 2022, when Russia launched its full-scale invasion against Ukraine, they were virtually alone. And they, in those first days, they were on their own and they repelled. We could also look at, Russia has not been able to rid the Kursk region of Ukrainian forces. It hasn't really been making significant territorial incursions. And before President Biden left office, he was careful to send to Ukraine everything that he could. So I think that the Ukrainians are going to hold the line. I think that we have a little bit of time for hopefully to better assess the situation. And I think that basically it's very important for there to be security guarantees, and Ukraine should never sign an agreement if they don't know what they're getting in exchange.
I'm curious. You are someone who has studied Ukraine, understand it. And I do wonder whether or not you think President Zelensky, there's pressure on him internally to step down. It certainly felt like there might be some of that coming externally from the United States at this point. But what do you think about internally? And from NATO members as well, or other European nations who are geographically closer to Ukraine than the United States is.
Right, right. It's important not to generalize about the whole Ukrainian population. He
Correct.
has his detractors and his supporters. And I think that Ukrainians agree that, in the context of a war, they can't hold elections. So I don't think he has his critics, but I don't think it rises to the level of let's remove Zelensky. I'm not hearing that, at least.
What message would you have for American people who say this is not the problem of Americans? What is happening in Ukraine is not something that every American wants to pay to defend. And we certainly saw that play out during the election. And we've seen that play out a lot in Congress over the last couple of years whenever a fight for funding comes up. What's your message to them?
My message to them is that actually this does have to do with the United States. Vance's statement that Zelensky hadn't said thank you suggests that the Americans think that they're giving Ukraine a gift. This is not a gift. It's an entitlement, right? Ukraine is a sovereign state, and in 1994, we signed security assurances that if their territorial integrity was violated, we would defend them militarily. So we committed to this, and if we want to maintain our integrity, in an international system of nation states, we will stand by our word. Failure to do so means we're not a credible partner or ally for anyone. Furthermore, siding with Russia destabilizes the transatlantic partnership that we've had for 80 years. It incentivizes countries to develop nuclear weapons, right? In that 1994 agreement, Ukraine agreed to give up its nuclear capacities in exchange for security guarantees. Well, now we have an incentive to develop for every country to develop their own nuclear weapons. It rewards a person who's been indicted for war crimes, Putin, and I think that it guarantees future fighting, right? If we want peace, we're going to come to the negotiating table in good faith, not in some sort of,
Right.
It's not
Well,
a deal.
Yeah, and I think the security concerns or guarantees were something that President Zelensky was trying to lock down there, no doubt, in the meeting with President Trump. Greta, thank you so much. Professor Greta Uehling, she's professor of international and comparative studies at the University of Michigan. Her book, Decolonizing Ukraine. This is Bloomberg.